Okay. There we go. All right. Well, good evening, everybody. We've got a great crowd here for night number 3 for Local Skills Academy. So just a little bit of background. I always tease Arden because she doesn't like to sleep at night and she just keeps coming up with more ideas. So she decided that Local Skills Academy would be the latest, greatest I Love Thorndale initiative to try to help bring people together throughout COVID, but also as a way to be able to promote some local businesses and neighbors who have some pretty cool skills. So that's what Local Skills is all about in a nutshell. And so far it seems to be pretty popular. I know that Arden's busy kind of filling the schedule. We've got lots of people that keep reaching out to be the next guest. So we'll just keep updating the website as we get more and more people added. But I think we're booked until the middle of March so far with lots more to come. So we should be able to keep going for a little while. So I'm just gonna, there's Gavin. All right, I'm gonna spotlight you, Gavin, so that everybody can see you. And not me. So if you want, Gavin, you can still change your settings to gallery view depending on your preference. But this way, just everybody can see you.
Okay, perfect.
All right, so I'm going to introduce Gavin Anderson. So thank you, Gavin, for joining us for week 3, the Local Skills Academy. Definitely a different feel. Week 1, we had dog grooming. And week 2, we had Zeraldo alpacas. So it's definitely a different flavor. So it's great to have you here. I know you love supporting community through lots of different initiatives. So hopefully you find this experience enjoyable also. So I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for the introduction. Yeah, my name is Gavin. I'm the president and brewmaster of Anderson Craft Ales in London. So we've been open for 4 years, just over 4 years now, making beer locally. So my plan for tonight is that I was just going to go over a bit of the, I guess, a variety of different styles of beer and the kind of some of the history behind them, and
$400.
some special and different and things like that. So if you want to follow along, I've got 6 different beers that we'll go through. By all means, don't feel pressured to drink 6 beers in the next half an hour. You can if you want. I won't judge anyone, but I probably will not have a full one of each of the 6 beers and save some for later. But I mean, the session is being recorded, so you could always have 1 or 2 and do the next tomorrow and the next tomorrow and make a whole week out of it, or you can just do them all now. That's fine too. So what I'm going to start with probably is we'll go kind of least intense or lightest to darkest. So first up, we've got one of our newer beers here, and it's called the Gold Ontario Lager. So this one is the lightest, I would say most easiest going beer that we make. I'm gonna get started here, so I have something to drink while I'm talking, and then we'll jump back and forth a bit. But you can see this one. I mean, it's nice, light, clear, easygoing, and this one is it's one of our more popular ones now. All of a sudden, and it's, like I said before, it's a lager. One of the most common questions I get asked is what's the difference between a lager and an ale, and I will eventually answer that. So beer, the history of beer. I hope everyone joined this with the intent of getting a history lesson. So we'll start with that. Beer is pretty much as old as civilization itself. There's evidence that's been found of stone tablets from ancient Sumerian cities like 5,000-6,000 years ago with beer recipes on them and ingredient inventories and things like that. So beer has been around pretty much as long as people have been around making cities and since agriculture pretty much. And since then it's changed quite a bit. So The earliest beers were basically just bread that some neglectful but observant Sumerian left in a bucket, and it filled up with water, and then he forgot about it, and a few days later noticed it was kind of foamy, and then for whatever reason decided to drink the foamy, soggy bread water, and felt pretty good afterwards. So I think that's kind of the earliest aspect of it, and because it's I mean, don't tell anyone, but beer is very easy to make. The tough part is making good beer. So to make beer, all you really need is any source of sugar. Usually they're grain based. So the most common is barley, but you'll have wheat beers, a lot of wheat beers. There's rye beers, and if you get into gluten-free beers, they use other grains like sorghum and millet and all kinds of things. So you need some kind of grain source, and then for sugar, and then you just need some water to dissolve all the sugar and flavor, and then you need some yeast, and then you just let it sit in a bucket for a week or two, and then you've got beer. So if you do that, it probably won't be very good. So it gets a lot more complicated if you want to make good beer, but if you just want to make some cheap homemade bread water, then that's all you need to do. So it was after that people really started refining it. I mean, if people have been brewing for 5 or 6,000 years, especially, I mean, it's been going through the Middle Ages. There was a lot of technological advancements. It was because it was boiled and because there's a small amount of alcohol in it, it was much safer than drinking the water at the time. So beer became super popular in that sense because it was the safest thing to drink. And then let's see, after that, it was very popular. One of the beers we have, which we'll get to eventually, it's our winter ale this year. So we change it up every now and then. Our winter was different a few years ago, but this one it's a Belgian double. So that's what the style is. And it's based off a style that was made very popular by Belgian monks and monasteries. And they started brewing beer, one, to kind of subsidize the costs of their churches and monasteries, and number two was to kind of bend the rules a bit and cheat during Lent. So a lot of the Belgian beers are pretty rich and pretty heavy and pretty high in like sugar and flavor, and that's because they weren't allowed to eat. They had to fast all through Lent and all day sometimes. But drinking was okay, and drinking beer was okay. So if you can have like a glass of basically liquid bread, it doesn't count as eating. So that was a pretty common tactic there. So that was another big jump in beer technology. Was when they started brewing different styles and heavier styles and more interesting flavors. And then let's see, like 1,000 years after that, that's when the Germans really got into it. So they actually passed. You may have heard of it before, but it's called the German Purity Law. So they made a rule in Germany that beer could only be made with certain ingredients and the base ingredients, and that's so they didn't get too weird with it. And that's when the first hops were finally added to beer too. So up until then, beer was just the 3 ingredients. Like I was saying, it's some kind of grain source, water, and yeast. And the 4th ingredient, that's the most modern one, is hops. And so that's what leads to a huge variety of the flavor differences and things. So the Germans really adopted the use of hops, and that's what makes a lot of their styles very distinctive. And then, speaking of hops, you've probably had an IPA or heard of an IPA. So hops were also found to be like a preservative to help the beer stability and shelf life. So, well, we'll get to that when we get to IPAs. I'm jumping all over the place here. So, anyways, from buckets of grain bin water to where we are now has been a long journey, but enjoyable one. So, anyways, back to the gold lager. So this one here, we brewed it to be most similar to like a common American lager or a traditional American lager. And so usually what you're going for with those is something very easy going, something easy drinking, and something really smooth and clean. And so it is a lager. So lagers are probably the newest, well, in the grand scheme of things, like the newest difference um, in beers. So everything before then was ales, and then lagers. Germans made lagers very popular, and they've quickly taken over as the one of the dominant kinds of beer. So the difference between ales and lagers, I promised I would talk about it. Now I'm finally back there. The difference between ales and lagers is the strain of yeast that's used. So when you're making beer, the four ingredients, malt, hops, water, and yeast, a lot of most of the flavor and the color comes from the malted barley. A lot of the flavor comes from the hops, depending on what variety you use, and a lot of the flavor comes from different strains of yeast. So yeast is just kind of everywhere. It's in the air. It's naturally occurring. It's on your skin. It's on a fruit, and it's on grains too. So if you were to just mash up some grains and put some hot water in it, there's natural yeast there that would bubble up and make a beer. It's kind of like a sourdough bread. Like you can mix some grain or some flour and water and leave it out, and it makes yeast, and it rises. So there's yeast everywhere. And so the most common is what they would call ale yeast. So they ferment quicker. They ferment at warmer temperatures. So they prefer about room temperature, like 18, 19, 20 degrees Celsius. And depending on the variety, they usually give off a lot of really cool and interesting flavors. So you'll often get fruity notes from them. A lot of Belgian ale yeasts have, yeah, like I said, fruity notes, sometimes bubble gum, sometimes like cherries, cloves. If you like wheat beers, if you've ever had German Weiss beers, you might pick up some notes of banana or clove, and that's from the ale yeast that's used in that. So lager yeast is kind of the exact opposite of that. It ferments at cold temperatures, and it ferments very slowly, and it ferments very, very cleanly. So you don't really get any yeast flavor from it. And when you're brewing a lager, that's what people are usually going for. So it was again discovered by the Germans, because they would, after the harvest in the fall, they would brew a bunch of beer, fill a bunch of casks, and load it into nearby caves or cellars where it would kind of sit cold for months, and then they'd bust them out in the spring, and or the opposite, they'd sometimes brew some in the spring, leave it in the caves through the summer months, and then in October for Oktoberfest, they'd tap all those beers that have been sitting there for months. So that's essentially what lagering is. I don't know any German, but I think someone can Google it. But lagering, I think, just means kind of like storing or aging or cellaring in German. I'm not 100% sure on that, but that's kind of the concept. If you're drinking ale, it's usually going to be more flavorful, and it's going to have some cool fruity flavors or different flavors. And if you're drinking a lager, it's usually going to be a slower beer to make, and it's going to be a lot cleaner and easier going. So quick break here. All right, so back to our gold lager here. So it's made with, I think I said that earlier, that beer is made with 4 ingredients, and that was a lie. You can make it with a lot of stuff. So this one here is made with 2 varieties of barley, and it has some corn in it, and it has 1 kind of hops and lager yeast. And so it takes 6 weeks for us to make a batch of this, because we really want that cool, fermented, easygoing, a smooth finish on it. And I think you can taste that. I mean, if you take it and smell it, you mostly get those sweet, grainy notes. So for me, and this would work with any kind of light lager. So whatever your preference is, if you like Miller or Coors or Budweiser, Canadian or Labatt's, next time you get one, try and pour it into a glass, kind of aerated bit, and then give it a couple whiffs and see what kind of notes you pick up. So you might pick up some really light graininess from the malt. You may get some sweet notes from corn, or a lot of them use rice. We don't use rice in this one, but a lot of light lagers do. And you might get some really subtle hop notes. For this type of beer, usually the hops are something like a little spicy or a little peppery or a little herbal, but it's going to be very, very easygoing. And the hop is not the hop or the malt is not really the point of a beer like this. It's something that is easygoing and cool and smooth, and it's the malt or the hops don't really stand out at all, and that's okay. I still like them.
Gavin, I think if they ever bring back Farmers Night, it'll be like name that grain or name that whatever. It'll be the whole trivia night. Beer.
Yeah, that would be interesting because I know a lot of the big ones, depending on the beer, some of them use 2-row barley, some use 6-row barley, some use corn, some don't, some use rice and some don't. And so you can sometimes pick up those notes from different beers and see what you prefer. For me, I like the corn ones. The rice doesn't really add anything to it. It just makes it lighter. The corn has a nice sweetness to it, and it's one that I like. So now moving on to the next one. Next one I'm going to try, it was our second lightest, and that's our cream ale here. So cream ale is a style that's been around a long time. The recipe we made for this one, we actually in an old beer book, we found some scraps of a recipe that was written like pre-prohibition in the States. So it's old style, and it was originally developed in the, I think, 1800s as a counter to all the lagers that were out there. So when people were just moving to America and Canada in the 1800s, they still wanted beer. And the Germans were making all these great lagers, but they didn't really have the know-how or technology here to get the lager yeasts or how to cold cellar them. So cream ales were made as kind of a counter to that, and it's an ale yeast. So like I said, it's a little bit fruitier, but it's a ale yeast that's lagered. So it's brewed with the ale yeast, but it's then cold conditioned for a couple weeks to make the flavor a little smoother. So you can see this one again. It's pretty light. It's nice and clear. It's pretty light. It's a golden color, and it's basically meant to be a lager made with an ale yeast. And it's been our, I would say, most popular one the last 4 years, and it's been very well recognized too. We won a national gold medal, 3 national silvers, and an international silver medal for this beer. So it's been super popular. It's probably my everyday go-to. It's one of my favorites. So yeah, and it's similar to the lager, but it has a little more. It's basically just a little more everything. So it has a little more malt character. It has a little more hop character. It's just kind of like a more, I would say, if you have like a premium lager, it would be more similar to that, or a craft lager or anything nearby. So this one. So we also use corn in this one, and that's common to a lot of beers that are brewed in North America, or styles that originate in North America, because we have tons of corn. I think corn is the #1 crop in North America, I think. Also not 100% sure on that. So a lot of the traditional beers made here have tons of corn in them, and you don't find that often in Europe. So yeah, this one you'll notice it's not a lot of bitterness in it. It has a little more hoppy notes and a little more sweet notes. So for me, I can smell the corn. I can smell a little bit of like grassy, spicy pepperiness from the hops. And that's about it. Yeah, it's not one that's super complicated, but it's just one of our more popular everyday ones. Another thing that I get asked all the time, or people try it and they're kind of not expecting it, is the name cream ale is super, super misleading because it's not creamy. It's not supposed to be creamy. It's not supposed to be like thick and milky or anything like that. And I mean, I've done a fair amount of research, and for the life of me, I can't figure out why it's called cream ale, like the style of beer. But it's been around for a couple hundred years, and the style is called cream ale, and I have no idea why, because it's not creamy. I don't know who named it or why. But that happens a lot. Someone will try it and they'll be like, "Oh, this isn't that creamy." Or people, if they say, "What's your lightest beer?" We say, "Oh, we got the cream ale," and they're like, "Oh, I don't want something that heavy." So it's a strange name, but and it's a style that is kind of open to a lot of interpretation too. So you'll see in Ontario with microbreweries. I mean, the most famous one, they're not a micro, but would be Sleeman's Cream Ale. I think that one's been around forever. And it's similar to ours. It's a golden ale. It's a easy drinker and it's popular. But then if you have something like Muskoka's Cream Ale, I don't know if anyone's tried that one. That one is a lot darker and it's a lot more sweet. So it's a style that no one's 100% sure what it is or what it should be, but ours won more awards, so I'm saying that it's right. So
Maybe
yeah,
whoever drank or whoever named the cream ale had too much bread water, and it's just a mess.
You can never have too much bread water.
Yeah.
Okay, so next up, I got a little bit more of that one. Okay, next up, if anyone has some or similar style, is the brown ale we make. So of all the beers we make, this one would be closest to a traditional English kind of beer. So English beers, I mean, they have everything now. You can get English lagers and whatnot, but the most common ones that would come out of England and Great Britain would be like your bitters, your milds, and stouts, obviously, but that's even more specific to Ireland. But usually, I'm about to go off on another tangent here. So usually, the most famous styles of beer that you can think of for different countries pretty much comes down to water chemistry. So if you think of like Ireland, what's the beer that you think of or the style you think of? And it would be stouts, probably a Guinness or a stout. If you think of England, you probably think of like copper to brown colored ales. If you think of like Germany or like the Czech area, you'd be thinking of Pilsners or light lagers. And like all these places all brewed all kinds of beers, but the ones that became famous are the ones that really were stellar examples or that really stood out. And the reason why those regions have those beers as their famous examples is because of the water profiles there. So where Guinness is brewed is really, really hard water, and it's pretty alkaline too. So the water has a high pH, and the pH range for making beer is pretty slim. If you usually when you mix the beer and water, you want your pH to be in the like mid fours, and then after it's done fermenting, it should be in the like mid high threes, 3.5 or 3.4, or even a bit higher. It is pretty acidic. Maybe it might even be low fours, but the malts that go into making these different beers, they can affect the pH too. So heavily roasted barleys for dark beers, they drop the pH quite a bit. So if you start with a neutral or a soft water and you add that in it, your stouts are going to be really acidic and they're going to have a strange bite to them and they're not going to taste very good. But if you brew a stout with water that has a high pH and a lot of minerals, it ends up right in the sweet spot for a really nice tasting beer. And it's the opposite for like blonde ales and lagers. If you brew a light blonde ale, it doesn't drop the pH very much. So if you brew it in high alkaline, high pH water, it's going to have like a weird chalky taste and it's not going to be that great. But if you brew it in soft water, it's going to be really, really nice, really smooth. So I mean, and back then when all these beers were being made, people didn't have pH meters and water testers and reverse osmosis systems. So they couldn't, the water you have is the water you brew with, and you're kind of stuck with it. So sometimes they would make really great stouts and terrible lagers, and others would make great lagers and terrible stouts. So that's what I was even talking about. The brown ale, I think. Anyways, back to that. So yeah, the brown ale is kind of like English ale, and English ales were often copper colored brown because they're with the pH and the water they have there and the water chemistry. Those are the beers that turned out the best. So why is the beer brown? It's still the same 4 ingredients. Pretty much every beer. We're gonna go from light lager to like really some different fruity ones, this brown ale, to IPAs to stout. It's still the same kind of barley, hops, water, and yeast. But you can kind of play around with the barley before you brew with it, and that's by toasting. So toasting or roasting or how it's processed. So if you just take barley and kind of harvest it and dry it and make a beer with it, you're going to have a light blonde, easygoing beer. If you take the barley and kind of toast it a little bit, then you're going to get some nutty notes. You're going to get a darker color. You're going to get some toasty notes. And if you go really far with it, if you take that barley and just high heat, big roast it like a coffee bean, you're going to get those same kind of coffee flavors in beer. You'll end up with a black colored beer that has coffee flavors, some dark chocolate, and some nuttiness and toastiness, and so you can go from there. And you can also same with them. You can take the malt, soak it in water for a while, and then slowly raise up the temperature, and the sugars inside start to caramelize and crystallize, and so you can get a lot of sweeter flavors out of the barley that way too. So there's a huge range of what you can, just with one ingredient with the barley, how you can treat it and toast it and steep it and crack it and do whatever that gives you a really wide flavor range. So back to our cream ale, we'll just go back a half step. The cream ale is just one kind of barley, corn. Oh no, I lied. Okay, there's 2 kinds of barley. There's one barley and a small amount of like the crystallized barley. So that's why the color is a little bit different than the gold. It's a little bit darker. And so the brown ale here, we use 7 different kinds of malt in it, and they're all toasted slightly different or roasted in a different way or processed in a different way. So that's why the color, if we go back to the color, it's a brownish dark copper. And that's because the malt has been toasted. I mean, just think of a piece of bread. Like you get white bread, you toast it, it gets darker. So, and it gives you a lot more flavor too. That's why toast is delicious. So the brown ale, we use 7 different malts. And for that one, I mean, if you smell it, you'll get a much different profile than you did from the other 2 beers. So this one, right off the bat for me, I get like crackers, toasted crackers, nuts, maybe like a milk chocolate almost kind of. And this one has very little hops in it. This is a beer where we want the malt to be the main focus. So if anyone ever asks you like, what is a malty beer? This beer's malty, or what beer you want to show off the malt characteristics, it would be usually something like an English ale or brown ales, any kind of brown ale. And those ones, like think of like a Newcastle Brown. That's a really famous English brown ale. Or some other ones I can't think of right now, put on the spot. But those ones, you'll get the same kind of little bit toasty, nutty chocolate flavor, and it's and those are all very malt focused too. So low bitterness, which makes them come off as a lot sweeter. So all beers have hops in them due to the sweetness. So how far back should we go here? So the beer, after you let's go back. Okay, how to make beer 101. Well, we're going all the way back. So to make beer, what we're trying to do is we're getting grain, and we want to take all the sugar and all the flavor out of that grain. And then after that, we throw in some yeast, and the yeast's job is to eat the sugar and turn it into alcohol. So the more sugar you get out of the grain, the more alcohol you're going to end up with in the beer. The more grain you use, the more alcohol you're going to use. So, God, where is I even going with this? I'm totally lost now. Okay.
Because you've had 3 beers in 10, 15 minutes.
All right. Anyways, brown
just
ales, very malty. And this one, oh, that's right, hops. There's not very much hops in this one. So, okay, going back. So we take the sugar out of the grain, add yeast, and the yeast eats that sugar and turns into alcohol. But there's always some sugar left because alcohol, I mean, it's delicious, but it's also poison, right? Especially for tiny little yeasties. So as it's fermenting, it'll get to a point where the alcohol level gets high enough that the yeast all just kind of die and drop out, and it will never get to 0% sugar. So depending on the style beer, you'll have a little bit or a lot of residual sugar. Like the gold lager, it's very light, very dry, very clean. The residual sugar in that one is like half a percent maybe. And then if you go on the far side, if you've ever had an Imperial Stout or like a barley wine or like a really strong like 10, 11, 12% beer, those ones often have like 5 or 6% sugar remaining. So that's a lot of sugar. Like they would be undrinkably sweet if there was no hops in it. So hops are added for, I was going to save the hop talk for the IPA. We're almost there. But hops are added for flavor for one, and for bitterness is number two. So without them, any beer, even light lagers, would be too sweet. That's usually not what people are going for. So hops are a key component for balance. Okay, now I remember why I started this conversation. So the brown ale, you'll notice, tastes, I think, sweeter than the last two probably. And that's because we use less hops in it because we want the malt flavors to really come out. And so, yeah, it does taste a bit sweeter. There's not more sugar in it or residual sugar compared to the cream ale, really. But because of the less hops we use, it tastes a bit sweeter. And so it tastes a bit, I don't know. I like it, but it's kind of like, I mean, I like all of them. That's not fair. But the brown is the main tasting notes here are toasty, nutty, like a light milk chocolate, and that's most similar to what a lot of English ales that are out there. All right, what should we do next? Quick break.
All right, should we check in with the audience?
Sure.
Yeah. All right. Who's following along with like tasting these beers as Gavin's chatting with them? Okay, I see Jackie, Mary Lou, yeah. Marianne, she's had 10 already. So Gordy, yes. I see the DeClarks, the Duncans. I saw you swirling and sniffing. Walkers, there, look, the whole Walker gang. Nice to see everybody. Perfect. Okay. Does anyone have any questions so far, or just kind of everything's coming together, soaking in?
Yeah,
Aaron's looking for a summary of technical terms. The bread water, yes, very technical, and tiny little yeasties. Yes, those are Cole's notes for this session. Yeah. A+ for Darren. You're following along. Good.
Hey, Gavin, where does Pilsner come in?
Pilsner?
Yeah.
So Pilsner is like a subset of lagers. So if the beer world is divided into ales and lagers, then from lagers, you even have a ton more branches, and they go all the way from light to dark too. So Pilsners are kind of a hoppy light lager. And even within Pilsners, you can split it again to like German Pilsners and Czech Pilsners, where they're slightly different. And that's, again, back to the water. That's based on the water profile. So Czech Pilsners are usually less bitter, more rounded, more smooth. And German Pilsners usually have a higher bitterness and more of a hop bite to them. But yeah, Pilsners, so that's a light style lager that usually has kind of moderate bitterness with a good amount of hop flavor. So when you have a Pilsner, like a real German Pilsner, if you get like, you can get, Budweiser at the LCBO beer store would be a Czech Pilsner. And then, oh man, I'm blanking again. But there's that German Pilsner, comes in a green can. What's it called? I don't know. No, it's I'll come back. I'll remember. I'll come back to it. But that's a good example, a really good example of a traditional German Pilsner, and because you get a lot of hop notes and there is a bitterness bite to it. So traditional Pilsners have a lot of like herbal notes and grassy. Like Steam Whistle is kind of a more of a Czech Pilsner. Like it has some hoppy notes too, but it's not. It's kind of been tamed, I think, a little bit for mass appeal. So any of the big beers out there these days, Canadian, like Budweiser, Blue, they all claim to be Pilsners. And I think at one point they were, like maybe in the 1800s, but over time they've really toned them down, I think, and started deviating away from the traditional Pilsner, which would just be one type of malt, a couple kinds of hops. And now they start putting in like corn and rice, and to really thin the flavor out and make them easier going. So there's a lot of beers out there that are Pilsners that maybe aren't the best examples of the traditional Pilsner style. Like American lagers is kind of its own category these days. It doesn't fit what a Pilsner used to be. But yeah,
We're
but
thinking Grolsch.
No, it's not Grolsch. But Grolsch is a Pilsner too, I think. But it's oh man, I'm just gonna Google it. Give me 1 second.
What's the German one you guys make? The hell yeah.
Oh, so we make a couple German lagers too. So we make a Helles every year. That's like a
It's
light.
delicious.
Yeah, I like the Helles. It's a German lager. And it's a little more malty and a little less hoppy than a Pilsner, but it's really close along the same lines. And it is our summer seasonal that we do every year for 3 months. That one's a traditional German Pilsner. So
Can I just pre-order a keg of that for next year, bud?
maybe I'll forget about it, but yeah, it is. We do it every year because we often with the seasonal, sometimes we change them up and mix them up. But I love Pilsners. Pilsner's my favorite style of beer. So that one's sticking around forever. So it'll be here. It'll be back in the summer. But back to lagers, from Pilsners or light ones, you have like your Oktoberfest style beer that are copper colored malty beers. Those are also lagers, even though they're maltier and darker. And then there's like Dunkels and Bocks and Doppelbocks that are like really dark, black, malty, heavy lagers. So the lager ale distinction is the yeast warm and a little more fruity, or is the yeast cold and clean? It can still be light or dark or hoppy or not. So it's these days it doesn't really matter. I think back in the 17 or 1800s, there was probably a pretty wild flavor difference when they were just kind of fermented in open wooden casks with no temperature control or anything like that. But the technology we have to brew beer now, there's very little difference between an ale and a lager. If you tried the cream ale and gold or something, they're not that different. The cream ale is a little more flavor, I think, but they're not wildly different styles.
All right, Scott Johnson, do you still have a question or comment?
Sure. What was the motivation for a ale-based microbrewery to brew lagers? Why did you decide to go the lager path?
I guess I think we just kind of went with Anderson Craft Ales because it sounds better than Anderson Craft Beers or Anderson Craft whatever we feel like making. But since we opened, our focus is still mostly ales because there's just a way more variety and variability and fun stuff you can do with them. But we also, me and the rest of the brewing team, we all like a good lager. So we usually just make stuff that we want to drink. And then if other people want to drink it too, that's great. So we don't want to be handcuffed by the name and only make ales. If we want to make a lager, we'll make the lager too. So we do a couple, but lagers, I mean, you'll see it. Most of the seasonal beers we do are like German lagers, different kinds. Like our autumn beer is Oktoberfest, like a copper colored German lager, and it's just a yeah. I mean, we just kind of brew everything. I think Anderson Craft Ales just sounds better.
Cool. Thanks.
All right. Did anyone else have any thoughts or questions? Darren says, are there any beers that use wild yeast, or are the yeast strains specific to the beer?
So there are beers that use wild yeast, lots of them. It's not something that we've really gotten into because it can it just takes a lot more time and effort. But some really cool ones are like Sawdust City up in Gravenhurst. They do one every year where they have a big, like it basically is just like a giant stainless steel pan, open top. They take it out in the forest, fill it with beer, and then just leave it and come back in like a week. And so that's all the natural wild yeast in the forest that land in it and ferment it. And those ones are pretty cool. I can't think of the name of it. Man, I'm just not good at being put on the spot. But yeah, if you look up like if you want to try a wild yeast beer, it's the Sawdust City. They make a good one. It's that container is called a cool ship. And so a lot of breweries do them. I know Bench in like the Niagara region, they do a lot of wild fermented ale stuff, and they have a cool ship, I think, as well. So, but those, I mean, the flavors are a lot more unpredictable, obviously, because it's just open to the air. It's whatever lands in there can just go to town and do its own thing. And sometimes they make good flavors, and sometimes they don't. So it's not something that we've really experimented with. But different yeast strains, we do use different yeast strains in the brewery. So we have a 2 or 3 different ale yeasts depending on what kind of beer we're making. Like the cream ale and IPA use one yeast. The winter beer that we're going to get to uses a different strain because we want different flavors out of that. And then we have a lager yeast, and our regular IPA uses the same ale yeast, but we have, man, the IPAs can be a whole category by itself. But the IPA, we have some hazier, juicier IPAs too, and those ones use a different strain of yeast that is supposed to really emphasize those notes.
All right. I better let you get back to it, or we'll run out of time and you won't be through all your list.
Oh yeah, what time? Okay, all right. Well, we can fast forward through a couple, but IPA, we got to talk about IPAs. IPAs is pretty much the defining beer style of craft beers. I think that's what really put craft breweries on the map, and especially American breweries. Like IPAs, I've said a bunch of times. There's been various like game changers throughout history, which is like learning to boil your beer, malting it, or adding hops, or things like that. But the recent developments in hop breeding has really changed the world of craft beer. I think it's made huge changes in the flavors and varieties. So okay, IPA, we'll get some IPA. So IPA, it stands for India Pale Ale. So we'll do, I mean, we got more history, but this one will be really quick. So I mentioned earlier that hops act as kind of a preservative. And so there was a time when there was a lot of British troops that were still in India, and they, as part of their payment, they got daily rations of beer. So the beer was all shipped from Britain. They weren't making any of it down there, and a lot of it was spoiling on the way. So they found out that if they dumped a ton of hops into it, it would last longer on the long journey. So they made them stronger. Alcohol is a preservative too. So they made the beers a bit stronger. They made them with a ton of hops. So they'd make it all the way to the troops in India. And then after drinking that for whoever knows how many years they were there, they came back to England and there was no beer like it. And so they were demanding like the India Pale Ales. They want the India Pale Ales, the pale ales that they had in India, because that's what they got used to. And so that's what really started the style. It's a slightly stronger beer, and it has a ton of hops in it for flavor and bitterness. So IPAs, they're still pretty light. I mean, this one, I would categorize ours as an American IPA. So it's part of the new IPA revolution that's been in the last 30 years or so. It's not a traditional English IPA. So a traditional English IPA would be a lot more caramelly, and it would be using English hops. And the English hops usually have flavor notes that are earthy, herbal, grassy, a little spicy. And that's not really the style we were going for. So most hops grown in North America now, all the really cool varieties, they've bred these hops into having wildly different flavor profiles. So now notes you can get out of hops, they can be spicy, earthy, piney, herbal, but you often get citrus, a lot of big citrus notes. So orange, grapefruit, you can get stone fruit, so peach, apricots, melon is another big one. There's even pineapple, coconut. It's just wild, and there's new hop varieties being developed every year by a lot of growers in the States and in Canada, and some of them are just like absolutely off the wall. Nothing added to them, but there's hop varieties where if you brew a beer with them, they'll taste like coconut or chocolate, or I had one that just tasted like wood, like wood. I don't know how to describe it, but it's so strange that it's just they haven't really done anything to it other than crossbreeding them with different varieties, and the amount of flavors you can get from it is insane. So our IPA, the hops we use in there, for me, I would say the major notes are citrus, melon, and maybe a little bit of tropical fruits or things like that too. So if you have IPA, give it a swirl. Yeah, I definitely smell melon and citrus. And you'll also notice the flavor profile and the aroma changes quite a bit as it warms up too. So and that's with all beers too. If you have a cold beer or room temperature beer, they're going to taste a lot different. So this one, our IPA, it's an American IPA. The malt is pretty basic on it. You can see it's pretty light in color because it's the opposite of the brown ale. So the brown ale, we want those malt notes to really shine. IPAs, we want the hop notes to really shine. So if you taste the IPA, if you taste any fruitiness, or if you taste any citrus or melon or grapefruit or anything like that, that's all from the hops. And so I haven't really talked about hops, but hops, if you've ever seen them, they're these long vines. They can grow 30, 40 feet long vines, and they have little flower cones that grow on them. And the flower cones is where all the goodness is. That's where all the flavor packed oils are. So they get handpicked or machine picked every year in the fall, and they dry them and ship them off to us to throw in the beer. I believe if you drive along the 403 toward Hamilton in the summer, there's a couple hop yards you can see from the highway. You'll see some telephone poles with these big stringers going up to them and like vines growing up. So those are hop farms. There's a pretty good hop farming scene in Ontario. We get probably about 30% of our hops locally grown. But there's only so much they can do here. Like hops, like wine, have a really strong like terroir component to them. So where they're grown has a huge impact on the flavor. So the best place to grow the really big citrusy, punchy hops is on the West Coast here. So like Oregon, Vancouver, like the Okanagan kind of area. So they can't, if they took those varieties of hops, try and grow them in Ontario, they just wouldn't taste very good. I mean, it's like if you try and take some like, I don't know, champagne grapes and plant them in your backyard, they're probably not going to be that good. So a lot of the hops, the region where they're grown has a big impact on the flavor. And so that's why like the IPA revolution kind of happened in America. It's because they took these hop varieties from Europe, grew them here, and then the flavors were wildly different. So you get a lot of citrus is the main one. Most modern American IPAs have a lot of citrus notes. And so the other defining feature of IPAs is the bitterness. They usually have more bitterness too. And that's also from the hops. So you can't really have one without the other. It's they grow. They have a lot of these oil pockets. Some of the oils are really flavorful. Some of the oils are bitter. And as of now, there's no way to really separate them. So if we want those citrusy flavors, we use a ton of hops, but that makes the bitterness creep up and up and up too. So that's kind of the background on IPAs and the difference. So, okay, quick break, and then one more IPA topic.
Hey,
Okay,
Gavin,
so-
I got a question about IPA.
Yeah,
Is Keith's really an IPA then?
I would say, I mean, Keith's is an IPA as much as like Coors Light is a Pilsner, I would say. Like at one point, it probably was, and it probably was like a traditional IPA. But in the last couple 100 years, they've kind of tweaked the recipe and toned it down to appeal to different markets. And that I wouldn't call it an IPA today, but
Yeah, 'cause your IP, like the difference between it and yours, like I would class it more as like a lager taste to yours.
yeah, I think they've really kind of, like I said, toned it down in the last like 60, 70 years or something like that. And you'll notice it still is more bitter and has a little more hop character than like a Coors Light or a Budweiser does. But compared to like an English IPA or a new like a craft brewery IPA, it's definitely not the same. So they've tweaked it. There's a lot of room for interpretation with any kind of beer style. So the newest trend in IPAs is originated in New England, and it's less than a decade old probably, and it's really hazy, really juicy, really fruity IPAs. So they didn't really change much with the hops, but there was a new strain of yeast that was kind of found out there that produced a ton of really great fruity flavors itself, and secondly, it kind of reacted with the hops some way to make them a little bit less bitter and bring out the fruitiness. So if you see anything that says New England IPA, hazy IPA, juicy IPA, anything like that, those are kind of the most recent iteration of the IPAs, and you'll find them quite cloudy. There's a lot of oats and wheat in there, which adds a lot of cloudiness, but gives it more of a creamy body. And they're usually less bitter, usually really fruit forward. So it's even within the IPA category, between a classic West Coast American IPA and the New England IPAs, they're kind of worlds apart too. So that's my IPA section.
Gavin, do you use pelletized hops or more loose leaf hops?
We use almost exclusively pelletized hops, and that's just kind of for practicality. And then a step before, some places use fresh wet hops when they pick them, and those are just like wildly impractical. I hate them. I'm never doing it again. But they just make such a mess. But usually loose leaf hops, there's a lot more vegetative material, and they just take up a ton more space. So when you're brewing with them, they absorb a lot of liquid, and you get less beer as a result. So the pellets have more surface area. They're better for brewing with and storing, and the shelf life is better too. So we all pretty much exclusively use pelletized hops. Oh, one more thing before we go off IPAs. If you ever heard the term dry hopping, so hops are usually added in the kettle when you're boiling the beer. You throw the hops in, and the boiling water kind of makes a tea and extracts all the flavor and bitterness out of it. But dry hopping happens during or after the beer has been fermented. And again, kind of like cream ale, I don't know why it's called dry hopping. It doesn't make any sense because you're dumping it right into the beer, and the beer is pretty wet. But it usually happens post fermentation, and you can get some different flavors out of it. So it's kind of, the analogy would be like a regular cup of coffee and a cold brew coffee. Same coffee beans, and you'll get kind of different flavor notes out of the two of them. So dry hopping is when you add the hops to the beer when it's cold after the fermentation, and you usually get more flavor and different kinds of flavor out of it. So most modern IPAs are hopped in the kettle and dry hopped. All right, next we got two more. How's our time? We gotta go a bit quicker. So Our winter ale, I mentioned at the start, but it's a Belgian style double. So Belgian ales are their own category. There's so many different kinds of Belgian beers, from golden ales and singles and saisons and doubles and triples, and there's even quadruples now. And those usually refer to the different strength and how they're brewed. So the Belgian double, it's called a double because I don't know. It's double. It's stronger than like a table beer, but it's not as strong as a triple or a quadruple. They kind of have their own tasting note. And so these ones are usually ruby red colored, and they have a lot of really fruity notes to them. Sometimes spicy, sometimes clove, but a lot of like cherry, prune, raisin, like dark fruit, and usually higher carbonation as well. So there's a lot of examples, not so many in the LCBO anymore, but you can find ones that are actually still brewed at monasteries in Belgium. So like Rochefort, Chimay Blue, I think, is a Belgian double that you can find at LCBOs, and Orval is a really good one too. I don't think they stock that one anymore, but these ones, most of the flavor in here comes from the malt. The color and the flavor comes from the malt. So a lot of those fruity notes are actually from the different malts, how they're roasted and toasted and caramelized. But then a huge percentage of this one is yeast flavor. So if you smell it, yeah, I think you'll definitely get like kind of cherry and plum and prune and those kind of fruity flavors. So a lot of that comes from the fermenting yeast as well. And if you get on the taste a little bit of clove or spicy notes, that's a yeast flavor. So there's only 4 ingredients in beer. We keep coming back to it: the malted barley, hops, water, and yeast. But within all those 4 categories, like each of them has a huge impact on the flavor. So this is a beer that's not really that hoppy. It's not really that malty. Most of this one is yeast flavor. And so you'll see that with a lot of Belgian beers too, that they're pretty basic on the grain side and the hop side, but they'll get really good fruity flavors, spicy flavors, even bubble gum, banana, that all that comes from the yeast. As the yeast is eating that sugar and making alcohol, it's kind of spitting off all these other byproducts too. And luckily the byproducts taste better than our byproducts.
The Walkers put in the chat, it tastes like root beer.
Root beer, yeah, I can kind of see that. Yeah, it's got the same kind of I don't know, yeah, that sweet. It is more of a sweet one too, because there's not very many hops in it, like I said. So this one's a little bit stronger too. I think it's 6.5%. So it's a bit stronger, and it's really really fruity. What time do we get cut off here? Is it 7:30 that we're supposed to end? Are we overtime?
Well, the thing is, Gavin, we've got nowhere to go. So like if people have to leave, they'll go. So it's just up to you and your time. So, they're not gonna
This is what I was
on us or anything. So
this was my evening plan, with or without the Zoom call.
yeah. There you go.
Okay, so one more beer style, and then we can kind of just be open to questions.
Sure.
So everyone's heard of them. Some people love them, some people don't. Stouts. So stouts, like we said before, Guinness is probably the most famous example, and they're really, really dark, really usually intense flavor. I mean, you can see this one. Most of them you've been able to see me through, but not this one. This one's really, really dark, and all that color and all that flavor comes from how the barley is roasted. So this one, I mean, ours is a bad example because we do put some coffee and some chocolate into our stout, and so it is as stouts go, it's pretty rich, and it has a lot of those like coffee chocolate flavors. But usually, if you have a Guinness, the coffee notes and bitter chocolate and burnt toast, that all just comes from how the barley is toasted. There's nothing else added to it. So another interesting fact about Guinness, I think a pint of Guinness has less calories than a pint of Budweiser. So usually people think that dark beers, like they're heavy, they're thick, they're strong, but the color and the flavor just come from toasting the barley. It has nothing to do with the strength or the calorie count or the body of the beer. So that's more how it's fermented and how much grain you use. So Guinness, yeah, I mean, it's, if you want flavor for calories, it packs a lot of punch. There's a lot of bang for your buck there. But these ones, like I said, very roasty chocolate. So if you smell that, you'll definitely get, for me, I get chocolate notes first, kind of like a dark chocolate bar, and then like coffee grounds. Not too much like burnt roasty. You'll get some that are really have a burnt flavor to them, and I don't love that so much. But yeah, ours, we're going for more chocolate coffee kind of flavor, and the taste is kind of up the same alley. So this one, the yeast is very clean, very neutral, not contributing much. Hops, pretty much nothing. This one is really all malt flavor. So it's just the roasted malt is just dominant, and it comes out for sure. If you've heard of Imperial Stouts too, it's a similar story to the IPAs, where they had to ship beer quite a long ways. So Imperial Stouts also originated in England, I think, Great Britain. It was some czar or someone from Russia was visiting and had the stouts and really liked them. And like I said, they're kind of region specific. How your water profile is depends on how good your beers are. And the stouts they had weren't so good. So she really liked the beers, the stouts that were made in Great Britain. But when they tried to ship them up to Russia, they would just freeze on the way. So beer, I mean, I'm sure everyone here's tossed a beer in their freezer, left some in the garage, and it just freezes and explodes. It's happened to all of us. But if you make it strong enough, it doesn't really happen anymore. So once you hit like 8, 9, 10%, it doesn't really freeze as much or at all. So Imperial Stouts were stouts that they really just bumped up the alcohol percentage. They're usually 10% or more. And that style originated because they were shipped to like the Imperial Court of Russia, and they had to not freeze on the way. So that's the background behind Imperial Stouts. I think we got through all the beers. So if anyone, we can just open up the floor to questions, I guess. Or I could just keep talking for
That was a lot of information. Like, who knew? I guess lots of people knew, but not.
I knew because I drink beer.
Oh, good. Okay. All righty. Does anyone have a question or any thoughts?
Yeah. How quickly can you turn around the brewing process? Like when you're brewing one beer, are you able to turn it around within a day to brew another kind of beer, or can you do multiples at the same time, or how are you handling that?
So the brewing part itself is pretty quick. We do a single brew takes about 6 hours. And when I say brew, that's kind of taking the barley, crushing it up, steeping it in water, just taking the liquid off, boiling it, adding the hops, cooling it down, adding the yeast. So that's kind of a brew day for us, and it's about 6 hours. So you can make a batch like that, but the real time consuming part is the fermentation and kind of the conditioning of the beer. So after a brew day where we've turned that grain into liquid, thrown the hops in, boiled it, send it away. At that point, it's usually, depending on the beer, like 10 to 15% sugar, 0% alcohol. So very, very sweet. Nobody wants to drink it. You throw the yeast in, and the yeast has to eat all those sugars and turn them into alcohol. And that can take anywhere from 3-4 days, for a Belgian ale, to several weeks, like three weeks for a lager. And then on top of that, after it's done fermenting, we cool the beer down to almost freezing, and that makes the yeast clump together and hibernate and sink. So that consuming part too. And it's essential for the flavor development and the clarifying the beer and stuff, but that can take anywhere from a week to 4, 5, 6 weeks too. So we can brew a beer really quick, but the fermentation, the conditioning, the clarifying, and the packaging, that's the really time consuming part. So I think our longest one was I think our autumn Oktoberfest that from brew to canning was about 8 weeks. And our quickest one is usually the IPAs where we want like the IPA, the fresh hoppy, fruity IPA flavors, they really go downhill quickly. So those you want them to people as fresh as possible. So from brew day to canning, those we can do in like 10, 12 days sometimes. So there's a really big difference depending on the style of beer, how quickly you can turn them around. But yeah, most of the time it's just the fermentation conditioning.
All right. Anyone else? A question?
I've got a comment. Actually, I've got a couple comments. So I just got this beer. This is
Nice.
Mexican porter.
Yeah.
Where did that come from? Where did
That was one of our other brewers came up with that one, and he was inspired by like a Mexican hot chocolate that someone made or he had somewhere. And so usually they'll take a hot chocolate and they'll spice it and it's a bit stronger. So it has it's more chocolatey. They'll throw cinnamon and vanilla and nutmeg and some ancho chilies and things in there. So he had that and was thinking about it and thinking like we could make a strong stout that kind of tastes like hot chocolate, and these flavors would pair really well with it. So he just kind of ran with it, and that's what came up. So that beer is a strong porter. That's another question that comes up a lot: is what's the difference between a porter and a stout? And the answer is not much difference. Like their stouts are usually more coffee and a little more bitter. Porters are usually a little sweeter, a little chocolatier. So the porter, it's a sweet, chocolatey base, and then we threw in all these different ancho peppers, cinnamon, vanilla, nutmeg, cocoa nibs, coconut to kind of replicate that hot chocolate that someone gave him. And so I really like that one. It's really rich and it packs a punch, but it's got a lot of flavor. I like the Mexican porter.
Yeah, I was kind of keen to try it tonight, but it's 8.7%, and I think if I had it at this point, I'd be on the floor in 15 minutes. So I mean,
Yeah.
I also wanted to mention too, Gavin, that I love how full the cans are. Like every time I crack one open, I'm always spilling on myself because it's like as full as possible. There's no air in it, hardly at all.
We're very nice and generous and just want to give everyone a bunch of free beer. But mostly that is because the two worst things for beer are sunlight and oxygen. And those two things can make a good beer go bad real quick. And so we're a small time brewery, so our canning line is by no means state of the art. And we found the only way to really keep the oxygen level in the packaged beer down is to make sure there's almost no airspace left in the top of it. So we filled them for a while, and we could measure the dissolved oxygen afterwards, and it wasn't where we wanted to be. And the beer, like after a month or so, it would start to really degrade. And so the best solution we came up with was just fill them right to the brim. And this way we can get like 6 months of stable flavor out of them. And that's really what we shoot for. But
yeah, it's kind of an added bonus because, like, to me, that's one of the things, other than obviously the way all the beers taste are usually pretty good. But that's like a bonus when you crack one of the, oh, yeah, it's an Anderson. It's like completely full to the top. Whereas normally you get the ones like everything else is just.
Yeah.
Has a
the downside is that if you open that Mexican porter and you have a white shirt on, you're gonna have like a shirt after that, I think.
Yeah, me and white shirts generally don't get along.
But the other one, so oxygen makes a beer taste really, stale, and it kills hop flavors very quickly. The other one, sunlight, I'm sure pretty much everyone has encountered it. Sunlight plus hops makes beers go skunky. So if you have ever had a skunky beer, you can probably narrow it down to either a clear bottle or a green bottle and a more hoppy beer. So some of the real main offenders are like Heineken, Grolsch, Corona, sometimes Stella. Those are the ones that are a little more hoppy, and just for marketing reasons, they use clear or green bottles, which don't block the sunlight. And so those beers can get that skunky off flavor really quickly. So that's why cans are great and light gets through them, or brown bottles block the light too. So there's no good reason to use clear or green bottles. You just do it because it looks cool.
The other question I
Gavin.
had, sorry, was how often you guys do one-off? So, like, I don't even know how many regular beers are in your lineup versus how often you do, you know, again, like a Mexican porter or something like a one-off. How often?
Yeah, we try and do 1 or 2 a month. So we have our, like the beers we have all the time. It's like our IPA cream ale. We've got an amber stout brown. But the one-offs, I mean, we just, it's the fun part of the job is experimenting with new flavors and stuff. So we do as many as we can, but it's usually 1 or 2 a month. So the Mexican porter out. But in December we had a gingerbread ale that we made that was like made with gingerbread spices, and we've got a German Dunkel coming up in the next couple weeks, which is like another German lager. We make a lot of German lagers, but yeah, we usually we can squeeze in 1 or 2 a month. It's just it's for fun, and if they really take off, then they might become permanent, but not usually.
Yeah, it'd be tough. It's kind of a tough. You get your regulars, and then it's fun too. I mean, you hit on something, and then it's good to have it once in a while because I mean, like, not that people don't come back, but it's just another thing to think about. I have a few beers that are like that where breweries only make them a certain time, and yeah, it's kind of a nice thing to do.
Okay, Gavin, we were wondering what the numbers on the back of the tins are.
Oh, right. I should have explained that earlier. So, if anyone's seen our cans, we usually put some, I'm going the wrong way, specs on here. And that, for beer nerds like myself, it's a way to really describe what's in the can without seeing it. So the first one, IBU, that stands for International Bittering Units. So right off the bat, that will give you an idea of how bitter the beer is going to be. So I just showed you our cream ale, which is one of our lighter, easier going ones. It's 24 IBU. The brown ale, which is one of the big malt focused ones, is 20. Come on, I can't figure this out. 21 IBU. And then our IPA, which is really hop focused and has more bitterness as a result, that one's 60. So generally, if it's 20 IBU or less, it's going to be a pretty light, sweet beer. If it's 40 to 70, it's going to be pretty bitter, like IPA. And if it's more than that, it's going to be very strong, unless it's a strong beer too. So I mentioned earlier that you kind of need the bitterness and hops to balance the sweetness that's naturally present in beer. So our IPA or our stout is 42. So that's pretty high, but it doesn't taste very bitter, and that's because there's so much richness and sweetness from the malt that you don't notice it. So the IBUs is it gives you a rough idea of how bitter the beer is going to be, but it doesn't tell the whole picture by any means. Now SRM is the next one, and that's standard reference method, and so that refers to the color. So 2 or 3 is about as light as it ever gets. That's like a really pale gold easygoing beer. And then when you get into the teens, 14, 16, that's kind of like a copper color. Our brown is 18, so that one was like a dark copper, light brown, I would say. And then what else do we have here? The stout, which is black, can't see through it. It's like blacker than night. That one is a 42. So that's pretty much the range, is like 2 or 3 to 40. And that gives you an idea what color the beer is going to be before you see it. So if it's less than 10, it's going to be pretty pale. If it's in the teens, it's going to be a amber, copper, brown. And if it's 30 or more, it's going to be dark black. So the last 2 numbers, the OG and the FG. So those are the sugar content before and after the beer gets fermented. It's original gravity and finishing gravity. And so the OG is not it's not really that important. Is the difference between the two that shows you how much alcohol's in it. And the lower the FG, the drier the beer is. So like our stout is pretty rich, it's pretty sweet, and our brown is pretty rich and sweet too. And those have an FG of, here's the brown, it's 3.4. So that means there's 3.4% sugar remaining in that beer. And so that gives you more body, more mouthfeel, and more flavor. And then our cream ale is 2.1. So it's significantly lighter, but it's by no means like super dry. And our gold, the gold's not written on the can, but the gold finishes at like 0.8. So it's really dry, really, really clean finishing. So that between those numbers, I mean, our cans are all opaque. That's kind of the advantage and disadvantage. You can't really see what you're getting. So those numbers give you a rough idea of how bitter it's going to be, what color it's going to be, and is it going to be sweet or dry.
That's a great question. Post-pandemic, when we all gather for a bonfire, we're gonna have all these fun facts. All right. Darren asked, what's your current favorite beer? Is that a fair question? Is that do you have a favorite?
Are we talking about my beer or just any beer in general?
However you want to answer it.
For my favorite beer, it's very, very seasonal, I would say. Like right now, I mean, like we just said, talked about the Mexican porter. It's like an 8%, really heavy, really rich stout. But if I come in from shoveling the driveway, and that's kind of what I want. It's like a strong, warm you up kind of beer. But on like a 32-degree summer day, that's not going to be my go-to. I love the beer, but I'm not going to drink it when I'm dripping sweat. So for me, my favorites are really seasonal. Summers I really like Pilsners. Fall, I usually trend towards the slightly maltier kind of brown amber lagers. Winter, then you go with the big heavy stouts, something that makes you forget how cold it is outside. And then spring is probably IPA, something fruity, fresh. Go for that. But yeah, I don't have a favorite. If I had to pick a favorite all year, I think it would be the cream ale. That's one that just easygoing and just pairs with anything. But usually my real favorite just changes depending on the season.
Perfect. And I see Chris has asked, what is your favorite non-Anderson craft beer or brewery? I know you just kind of answered the beer one, but non-Anderson brewery?
Oh, that's pretty tough. I mean, since I get unlimited beer for free, I don't try a lot of other stuff anymore as much. But when I do, I mean, I really like. There's a couple in Toronto that we're fans of. Like Left Field, we've brewed some stuff with them before, and they're really nice, and all the beers they make is really great. In town, well, all the breweries in town are great to work with, and they make good stuff as well. But it really, I mean, it depends what you want. I think there's great breweries out there, but none of them, I think, make the best of everything. So that's a really hard one to answer without singling anybody out. But
They don't live
yeah,
in Thorndale and take part in local skills academy. So
Yeah.
obviously Anderson's is the best.
No more was on here.
All right. Well, does anyone else have any questions or?
Yes,
yes.
Gavin, do you think that there's going to be a problem with breweries? There's so many microbreweries out there now with the competition, and what do you see for the future of it?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of been a gold rush in the last decade, I think, of breweries opening and popping up. And for a while, really the only thing you needed to be successful was like open your doors, and that was it. You'd be okay. But I think now, I mean, this year has been a real stress test for a lot of breweries. People aren't going to go out of their way to get ones that they don't like as much. So, we kind of see it leveling off too. So the percentage of beer sold, craft breweries versus the big guys like Molson, Coors, and Budweiser, it's been shooting up pretty sharp, but now the curve is starting to flatten out. So I think in Ontario, we're at about 12 or 13% craft breweries compared to the like 87% macros, like the big guys. And the US, the craft beer revolution is probably 5 or 10 years ahead of what we have here. And they've seen the curve really flatline around 15%. So at some point soon, I think it's gonna really flatten out, and that will be, I mean, it will definitely separate the good breweries from the weak ones, I think, in the next 5 years or so, probably. But for now, I think everybody's still doing okay. I haven't heard of too many breweries go out of business recently, but yeah, I think in the next 5 years, it's gonna get a lot more competitive.
I have one more question. We, maybe I missed some, our battery died at some point in time. Did you address sours at all? I don't like sours, but my son-in-law loves them. I think they're like lemonade.
Yeah, no, I didn't talk about sours, and we actually have one now. I didn't include it in the pack. We have a raspberry fruit sour, but it's a whole, oh, there's a raspberry fruit sour. Yep. But it's a whole different category, really, because like I keep going back to the four main ingredients in beer are water, barley, hops, and yeast. And when you make sours, you throw in a fifth ingredient, which is bacteria. So there's also several kinds of sours. So the most popular that you'll see now and the most common on the market are what are called kettle sours. So those, when you're in the process of brewing a batch, you dose them with the same, it's lactobacillus. So it's the same kind of bacteria that turns milk into yogurt. So and sourdough, makes sourdough. So it kind of eats sugar and makes sourness, lowers the pH. And so you can specifically, like you can purposely add that to your beer, and it will make your sour and will drop the pH. And I mean, it works well with a lot of styles, I think, especially fruit beers. I think it's really, really refreshing, and it adds a really nice note to it. But the advantage of kettle sours is that after you're done brewing it, you boil it, you kill everything, and you don't have to worry about it. So the other kind of sours happen kind of post fermentation, and those ones get real funky. So you can have, if you've ever had like a lambic or a goose or Oud Bruin, I think is one of Flanders Red. So those are all ones that are usually aged for a long amount of time with wild yeast, wild bacteria, or other things that make them sour. And so those ones, kettle sours are nice because you get a real clean sourness because you're doing it on purpose. But other sours, they're just kind of naturally occurring bacteria, which can produce a lot of real funky notes too. So it can be more of a vinegar sourness and less of a clean like yogurt sourness. And so those, you really don't see many of those in craft breweries because they take like a year to make, and they could still turn out to be garbage after a year. So those are really just old Belgian established breweries that have the right mix of yeast in the air that can make them no problem. But yeah, most sours are just a regular beer inoculated with bacteria to make them sour on purpose.
Thank you.
Do they add fruit to it at all? They do add fruit to it.
Can, but you don't have to. So the one that we've brewed recently, we've done a couple, but the most recent one we added a ton of raspberries to, because the sourness by itself can be a little bit off-putting, and you can get some off flavors that make it taste a bit like I don't know, like bile. It's really unappealing. So by itself, yeah. Some, like if you let stuff sour with bacteria and you're not carefully controlling it, like you can get some really bad flavors there. So but the sourness pairs, if you get a nice clean sourness, it pairs really well with fruit, I think. And so that's what's been really popular recently is fruit sours. But there's other kinds like Gosa. So Gosa is a German sour wheat beer, and that one has no fruit in it. It's usually just wheat wheat beer, sourness, and coriander. So they're pretty rare because they're and salt. They have a bunch of salt in them too because the natural water, they're salty. So they're not very popular. A straight up Gosa is not popular because they're not very good. You'll see a lot of fruit Gosas because I think, like I said, the fruit flavors pair really well with the sourness. People don't really want sour beer, just plain sour beer. It's not very good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so I think everybody saw a whole bunch of Facebook posts, and we're trying to direct attention to Anderson's, obviously specifically. So I think I'll just mention you can order online. Looks like you're doing delivery. I know you offered free delivery for this special promotion here, but andersoncraftales.ca, and that's how you can, one way you can buy Anderson beer. But I know Arden had me go into the beer store one day and buy some.
Yeah, I mean, I should say if anybody's in town and they want some, just let me know and I'll like bring it home. No shipping. So there's a couple people like across the street that will order online and just make a note, like, Gavin, please bring it to me. So so that's an option. But
it's like neighbors with benefits. That's like a whole new thing. Everybody's gonna love Thorndale a whole lot more. All right.
You need like an ice cream truck for beer just to go through town.
oh man, I wish we could do that because we have. I mean, I don't know if we have a big old work van that I've brought home a couple times when I'm like just moving big stuff myself. And if we could put a little bell on that and just slide open the side door and drive around town, I totally would. But I think that I would get arrested for it.
You ever seen those the motorized bars going through like they have?
Yeah, I have. So the problem is here in Ontario, it's not legal to have alcohol in them in between stops. So they've got these big bars and they have like the pedal pubs and things, but like you go brewery to brewery, but you're not allowed to drink anything in between. So the alcohol laws here are pretty strict. It takes a lot of the fun out of it.
I just say we go around Thorndale. Ain't no one gonna stop us in this town, bud.
All right. Have you seen the neighbors page? You'll be stopped immediately. Actually, I Love Thorndale did look into one of those brewery pedal bike things because we thought that is exactly what Thorndale needed. And we thought, like, could we even just pedal around the fairgrounds? And, you know, like that was the event. Like, we'll pedal you from Diamond to Ball Diamond. But anyway, we decided that probably wasn't really a great investment. But so, yes, pedal bar would be great. Okay, well, we could probably go on and on all night, but we should probably wrap her up at some point, or maybe we'll do Anderson's part 2. It seems to be like there's lots to talk about and lots of questions. So, this person needs to go to bed and not learn more about beer. So I thought I'd just mention next week we have Lily Lane Decor and Design. So quite a different topic. So I think Gord Johnson's got some furniture he's ready to refresh there. So Robin Ray, who's just outside of Thorndale, is going to be doing like a furniture refresh. So if you've ever thought about doing any kind of painting techniques to kind of freshen up some old furniture, then that's what next week's topic's all about. So she uses Country Chic paint, and she's offering 20% off if anybody wants to mention the local Skills Academy to pick up some paint from her. And she's going to do a safe porch pickup option for you. So anyway, that's happening next week. And then I think the week after that is the Market on King. And then there's a real estate panel and a bunch of other stuff coming up. So I guess before we sign off, is there anyone else that has a question? I see the Walkers and Debbie. A few people have turned on their video. It's nice to see everybody.
Saw one question that came in by chat that I forgot to answer. What's a beer you've tried to make but end up with a terrible product? Tomato basil beer. It's not good. It's no good. I want to make like a pizza flavored beer to go with pizza, but no, don't try it. It's not good.
Good to know.
Thanks very much, guys. Thanks, Gavin. Thanks, Peggy.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Okay, so I think we'll wrap it up here. And once again, Gavin, thank you so much for hopping on and sharing all of your beer
ask that
expertise
question?
and experiences.
Oh yeah, no problem. Anytime.
Yeah, it's super interesting. So I'm sure you're going to get tons of messages now, like, thanks for offering to deliver to my porch. So keep us posted how that goes.
All right, will do.
All right, take care, everybody. See you next week.
Thank you, Gavin. Good night, everyone.
All right, thank you.